Trees are among the oldest and most widespread life forms on Earth, and yet for most of human history, the study of trees as organisms in their own right remained marginal to the broader concerns of natural philosophy and later biology. This seeming paradox becomes less surprising when one considers that trees were, for millennia, so thoroughly integrated into the material circumstances of everyday life that they functioned less as objects of scientific curiosity than as elements of an economic and social infrastructure, comparable in some ways to how we might regard roads or buildings today. The transformation of trees from economic resources into subjects of sustained scientific investigation is itself a historical process with deep roots in changing economic needs, shifting intellectual frameworks, and evolving institutional structures, and tracing this transformation reveals much about how human societies have understood and interacted with the natural world across different periods and contexts. The earliest written references to trees in what might loosely be called scientific contexts come from ancient Mesopotamia and Egypt, where administrative records document the cultivation of date palms and various fruit-bearing species. These records are primarily economic documents, concerned with yields, irrigation requirements, and labour allocation, but they also reveal a sophisticated empirical understanding of plant behaviour that was accumulated over centuries of careful observation. Sumerian texts from the 3rd millennium BCE describe grafting techniques for date palms, a procedure that requires considerable knowledge of plant physiology, even if that knowledge was never articulated in theoretical terms. The Babylonians maintained records of flowering times and fruiting cycles that allowed them to predict agricultural outputs with reasonable accuracy, and this practical knowledge was transmitted across generations through scribal traditions that treated botanical information as one component of a broader administrative curriculum. What is notable about these early records is the complete absence of any attempt to explain why trees behaved as they did. The focus was entirely on documenting patterns that could be exploited for productive purposes, and this instrumental orientation toward botanical knowledge would persist in various forms for thousands of years. Greek natural philosophy introduced a different mode of inquiry, one that sought to explain natural phenomena through underlying principles rather than merely cataloguing observed regularities. Theophrastus, a student of Aristotle who lived in the 4th and 3rd centuries BCE, produced works on plants that represent the first systematic attempt to develop a theoretical framework for understanding botanical phenomena. His inquiry into plants and on the causes of plants addressed questions about plant structure, growth, reproduction, and classification in ways that went beyond simple agricultural observation. Theophrastus recognized that trees differed from other plants in fundamental ways, noting their greater longevity, their development of woody tissue, and their patterns of annual growth. He attempted to classify trees according to various criteria, including their leaves, their fruits, and the environments in which they grew. And while his classification system was later superseded, it established a template for botanical inquiry that would influence subsequent thinkers for centuries. What is particularly significant about Theophrastus is his attention to the relationship between trees and their environments. He documented how the same species might exhibit different characteristics when grown in different soils or climates, an observation that would later become central to ecological thinking, but that was largely forgotten during the long centuries when botanical knowledge was transmitted primarily through manuscript copying rather than renewed observation. The Roman period saw a partial return to the instrumental orientation of earlier agricultural societies, though Roman writers on agriculture incorporated Greek theoretical frameworks into their practical advice. Columella, Varro, and Pliny the Elder all wrote extensively about trees, particularly those species that were economically important to the Roman agricultural economy. Pliny's Natural History, compiled in the 1st century CE, devoted considerable attention to trees, documenting their uses, their geographic distributions, and various beliefs about their properties. Much of what Pliny recorded was derived from earlier sources rather than personal observation, and his compilation included both accurate empirical information and claims that later investigation would reveal to be unfounded. This characteristic of Roman natural history, the tendency to accumulate and transmit received knowledge without systematic verification, would shape the subsequent development of botanical knowledge in ways that were not entirely beneficial. When Pliny's work became a foundational text for medieval European scholars, it transmitted both genuine observations and errors with equal authority, and the project of separating valid knowledge from accumulated misconception would occupy naturalists for centuries after the revival of empirical investigation during the Renaissance. Medieval European understanding of trees operated within intellectual frameworks that differed substantially from both ancient naturalism and modern science. The dominant interpretive mode was allegorical. Trees and other natural phenomena were understood primarily as elements of a divinely ordered creation, whose meanings were to be found in their symbolic correspondences rather than their material properties. This does not mean that medieval Europeans lacked practical knowledge of trees, for the management of forests, orchards and woodlands required detailed empirical understanding that was transmitted through oral tradition and practical training. What it does mean is that this practical knowledge was rarely recorded in written form and was largely disconnected from the scholarly traditions that produced texts on natural philosophy. The few medieval European texts that discuss trees in any detail were primarily concerned with their symbolic meanings or their medicinal properties, both domains in which ancient authorities remained influential. The result was a curious bifurcation of knowledge. Those who actually worked with trees possessed considerable empirical understanding that went unrecorded, while those who wrote about trees often reproduced ancient claims without verification or original observation. This situation began to change during the 15th and 16th centuries, when several developments converged to create new conditions for botanical investigation. The introduction of printing made it possible to reproduce images accurately across multiple copies, reducing the degradation of botanical illustrations that had occurred during centuries of manuscript copying. European exploration of Africa, Asia and the Americas brought specimens of previously unknown plants to the attention of European naturalists, creating both practical and intellectual incentives for developing more adequate systems of classification and description. The recovery of additional ancient texts and the gradual spread of humanist methods of textual criticism made scholars more aware of inconsistencies and errors in received botanical knowledge, encouraging direct observation as a corrective to textual authority. The establishment of botanical gardens, initially as adjuncts to medical faculties, provided institutional spaces where plants could be grown, observed, and compared under controlled conditions. These developments did not immediately produce modern botany, but they created the preconditions for a more systematic and empirical approach to plant investigation that would develop over the following centuries. The 17th century saw the emergence of new questions about trees that required new methods to answer. The discovery of the microscope revealed levels of plant structure that had been entirely invisible to previous observers, and investigators began to document the cellular organization of wood, bark, and other plant tissues. Robert Hooke's observations of cork, which led him to coin the term cell for the small compartments he observed, were among the foundational moments in the development of cell theory, though the full significance of these observations would not become clear until much later. Nehemiah Grew and Marcello Malpighi independently developed detailed accounts of plant anatomy, describing vascular systems, reproductive structures, and patterns of tissue organization that revealed trees to be far more complex than simple observation suggested. These anatomical investigations raised new questions about how trees functioned, how water and nutrients moved through their structures, and how they grew and reproduced, questions that would occupy plant physiologists for centuries and that remain active areas of research today. The 18th century brought systematic efforts to classify all known plants, including trees, within comprehensive taxonomic frameworks. Carl Linnaeus, whose binomial nomenclature system remains the foundation of biological classification, included numerous tree species in his Species Plantarum of 1753, which is conventionally taken as the starting point for modern botanical nomenclature. Linnaeus's system was based primarily on reproductive structures, particularly the number and arrangement of stamens and pistils, and while this approach had certain advantages for classification purposes, it also grouped together plants that were quite dissimilar in most other respects while separating plants that seemed obviously related. The limitations of Linnaean classification became increasingly apparent during the 19th century, when naturalists began to seek classification systems that reflected what they understood as natural relationships, rather than artificial similarities. The development of evolutionary theory provided a theoretical framework for understanding these natural relationships as genealogical connections, and the project of reconstructing the evolutionary history of plant groups, including the various lineages of trees, became a major focus of botanical research that continues to the present day. The understanding of how trees grow and function underwent substantial revision during the 19th and 20th centuries as new experimental techniques became available. The discovery that plants obtain carbon from atmospheric carbon dioxide rather than from soil, a finding established through careful experiments by Jan Ingenhousz, Joseph Priestley and others in the late 18th century, was fundamental to understanding how trees and other plants produce the organic matter that constitutes their structures. The elucidation of photosynthesis as a complex biochemical process extended over more than a century, from the initial recognition that light was essential for plant growth, through the identification of chlorophyll and other photosynthetic pigments, to the detailed mapping of the biochemical pathways through which carbon dioxide is converted into sugars. This work revealed trees to be remarkably efficient chemical factories, capable of converting simple inorganic materials into complex organic compounds using only sunlight as an energy source, and it established the fundamental importance of trees and other photosynthetic organisms to the global carbon cycle and to the maintenance of atmospheric oxygen levels. The study of how water moves through trees from roots to leaves proved particularly challenging, as the heights achieved by some tree species seemed to exceed what could be explained by simple physical principles. The cohesion tension theory, developed in the late 19th century and subsequently refined, proposed that water is pulled upward through trees by the evaporative loss of water from leaf surfaces, with the cohesive properties of water molecules allowing this pull to be transmitted through continuous water columns in the xylem vessels. This theory was initially controversial because it required assuming that water columns in trees were under considerable negative pressure, a condition that seemed thermodynamically unstable. Subsequent research using increasingly sophisticated measurement techniques confirmed that water in tree xylem does indeed exist under negative pressure, sometimes exceeding 10 atmospheres in magnitude, and that the cohesion tension mechanism is the primary driver of long-distance water transport in trees. The discovery that trees living in different environments have evolved different strategies for managing the risks associated with negative pressure water transport, including variations in vessel diameter, vessel length, and the distribution of safety mechanisms that limit the spread of air bubbles, reveal the diversity of physiological solutions that trees have developed for the fundamental challenge of moving water from soil to canopy. The wood that trees produce has been a subject of investigation from multiple disciplinary perspectives, each revealing different aspects of this remarkably versatile material. From an economic standpoint, wood has been among the most important raw materials in human history, serving as fuel, construction material, tool-making substrate, and source of numerous derived products including paper, charcoal, and various chemicals. The physical properties of wood, including its strength-to-weight ratio, its workability with simple tools, and its availability in most environments, made it indispensable to pre-industrial societies, and the transition away from wood as a primary industrial material is a relatively recent development in human history. From a biological standpoint, wood is the product of secondary growth, a developmental process in which the vascular cambium, a thin layer of meristematic tissue, produces new cells that differentiate into xylem toward the interior of the stem and phloem toward the exterior. The properties of wood vary considerably depending on the rate of growth, the proportions of different cell types, and the chemical composition of cell walls, and these variations affect both the mechanical properties of wood and its suitability for different uses. Hardwoods and softwoods differ systematically in their cellular structure, with hardwoods containing vessel elements that are absent in softwoods, and these structural differences explain many of the practical differences between these wood types that have been recognized for millennia. The study of tree rings, or dendrochronology, developed as a scientific discipline during the 20th century and has provided remarkably detailed records of past environmental conditions, as well as precise dating tools for archaeological and historical research. Andrew Ellicott Douglas, an astronomer investigating possible relationships between solar cycles and terrestrial climate, pioneered the systematic use of tree rings as climate records in the early 20th century. He recognized that the width of annual growth rings reflected the environmental conditions experienced by a tree during the growing season, and that patterns of wide and narrow rings could be matched across trees from the same region to construct continuous chronologies extending back thousands of years. The development of cross-dating techniques, which allow ring patterns from overlapping but temporally offset specimens to be matched and combined, made it possible to extend tree ring chronologies far beyond the lifespan of any individual tree. The bristlecone pines of the American Southwest, some of which live for more than 4,000 years, provided particularly valuable material for constructing long chronologies, and these chronologies have been essential for calibrating radiocarbon dating, which would otherwise produce systematically incorrect dates for samples older than a few thousand years. Dendrochronological methods have found applications far beyond climate reconstruction, including the dating of historical buildings, the authentication of wooden artifacts, and the investigation of past forest dynamics. The analysis of tree rings from structural timbers has allowed historians to determine when buildings were constructed with a precision often exceeding that of documentary evidence, and in some cases has revealed that buildings believed to date from one period were actually constructed at quite different times. The study of tree rings from living and dead trees in forest stands has provided detailed records of past disturbance events, including fires, insect outbreaks, and windstorms, allowing ecologists to reconstruct forest histories over centuries or millennia. The chemical analysis of wood from specific growth rings has made it possible to track changes in atmospheric composition, including the rise of industrial pollutants and changes in carbon isotope ratios associated with fossil fuel combustion. These applications demonstrate the remarkable archive of environmental and historical information preserved in tree rings, information that continues to be extracted and interpreted as analytical techniques improve. The ecological relationships between trees and other organisms constitute a vast field of investigation that has revealed the complexity of forest ecosystems. Trees provide habitat for enormous numbers of other species, from the microorganisms that inhabit root systems to the birds and mammals that nest in canopies, and the relationships between trees and these associated organisms range from mutualistic to parasitic, from obligate to facultative, from ancient to recently evolved. The mycorrhizal associations between tree roots and soil fungi have attracted particular attention because of their ubiquity and their importance for tree nutrition. Most tree species form mycorrhizal associations of one type or another, and these associations can dramatically enhance the ability of trees to obtain water and mineral nutrients from soil. The fungal partners receive carbon compounds from tree photosynthesis while providing the tree with access to nutrients, particularly phosphorus, that would otherwise be largely unavailable. Research on forest mycorrhizal networks has revealed that individual trees are connected through shared fungal partners into networks that can transfer carbon and nutrients between trees, potentially allowing resources to flow from well-resourced to stressed individuals. The ecological significance of these networks remains a subject of active investigation and some controversy, with disagreement about how much material actually moves between trees through fungal connections and whether such transfers represent evolved cooperation or simply byproducts of fungal activity. The interactions between trees and herbivores, including insects, mammals, and pathogens, have shaped the evolution of tree defensive strategies in ways that are now beginning to be understood in chemical and molecular detail. Trees produce an enormous diversity of secondary metabolites, compounds that do not appear to play direct roles in growth or reproduction, but the function to deter herbivores, attract pollinators, or inhibit competitors. Tannins, terpenes, alkaloids, and phenolic compounds are among the many classes of defensive chemicals that trees synthesize, and the specific defensive profiles of different tree species reflect their evolutionary histories and the particular herbivore communities with which they have co-evolved. Some tree defenses are constitutive, present at all times regardless of whether the tree is under attack, while others are induced, produced, or upregulated in response to damage. The signaling systems that allow trees to detect herbivore attack and mount appropriate responses involve complex networks of chemical messengers, including volatile compounds that can transmit information between different parts of the same tree and potentially to neighbouring trees as well. The extent to which airborne chemical signals actually coordinate defensive responses across trees remains a subject of ongoing research, with some studies finding evidence for such communication and others failing to replicate earlier positive results. Forest dynamics, the processes by which forest composition and structure change over time, have been studied intensively since the early 20th century, yielding insights that have informed forest management and conservation efforts. The concept of ecological succession, the observation that plant communities tend to change in predictable ways following disturbance, was developed partly through observations of forest systems. Early formulations of succession theory proposed that communities progress towards stable climax, states determined primarily by climate, but subsequent research revealed that this model was too simple to capture the actual dynamics of most forests. Disturbance events of varying severity and frequency continually reset successional trajectories in different parts of landscapes, creating mosaics of patches at different stages rather than uniform climax communities. The gap dynamics framework, which focuses on the small-scale disturbances created by the death of individual canopy trees, has proven particularly useful for understanding how forest composition changes over time in the absence of major disturbances. When a large tree dies or falls, it creates a gap in the canopy that alters light, temperature, and moisture conditions at the forest floor, and the species that successfully colonize these gaps determine the future composition of the forest. Different tree species have different strategies for exploiting gaps, with some maintaining seedling banks in the understory that can respond rapidly when gaps appear, and others relying on long-distance seed dispersal to colonize new gaps. The relative success of these different strategies depends on gap size, frequency, and spatial distribution, as well as on numerous other factors, making forest dynamics predictions inherently complex. The global distribution of forests reflects the interaction of climate, geology, evolutionary history, and human activity over thousands to millions of years. Tropical rainforests, which contain the highest tree species diversity of any forest type, occur in equatorial regions where high rainfall and warm temperatures permit year-round growth. The species richness of tropical forests has posed persistent puzzles for ecologists, as standard theories suggest that the most competitive species should eventually dominate and reduce diversity, yet hundreds of tree species can coexist within single hectares of rainforest. Various mechanisms have been proposed to explain this diversity, including niche differentiation along environmental gradients, negative density dependence that disadvantages common species, and non-equilibrium dynamics in which competitive exclusion proceeds too slowly to eliminate rare species. Research on tropical forest plots that have been monitored for decades has provided data on growth, mortality, and recruitment rates that allow some of these hypotheses to be tested, though the long generation times of trees mean that understanding forest dynamics requires long-term commitment to data collection that spans human career lengths and beyond. Temperate forests, which occur in mid-latitude regions with distinct seasons, generally contain fewer tree species than tropical forests, but support their own characteristic communities of associated organisms. The deciduous forests of eastern North America, Europe, and East Asia are dominated by broad-leaved species that shed their leaves during winter, an adaptation to cold temperatures that would otherwise damage exposed photosynthetic tissues. The physiological costs and benefits of deciduousness depend on climate details, particularly the length and severity of the cold season and the availability of water during the growing season, and the boundaries between deciduous and evergreen forest types often correspond to specific climate thresholds. The evergreen coniferous forests that dominate in colder climates and on nutrient-poor soils represent an alternative strategy, in which the costs of producing new leaves each year are avoided, but the costs of maintaining leaves through unfavourable periods are incurred instead. The needle-like leaves of conifers, with their thick cuticles and recessed stomata, are adaptations that reduce water loss under conditions of cold or drought, but also limit the rate of photosynthesis under favourable conditions, creating trade-offs that different species resolve in different ways. Boreal forests, the vast coniferous forests that encircle the globe in northern latitudes, constitute one of Earth's largest biomes and play significant roles in global carbon and water cycles. These forests are dominated by a relatively small number of tree genera, including spruce, fir, pine, and larch, and support characteristic assemblages of mammals, birds, and other organisms adapted to cold winters and short growing seasons. The dynamics of boreal forests are strongly influenced by fire, which returns at intervals ranging from decades to centuries depending on region and forest type, and the species composition of boreal forests reflects adaptations to fire regimes as well as to cold climate. Some boreal species are fire-adapted, producing serotinous cones that release seeds following fire or re-sprouting vigorously after their above-ground parts are killed, while others persist mainly in fire effusia where burning is infrequent. The vast stores of carbon in boreal forest soils and biomass make these systems important in global carbon accounting, and the potential for climate change to alter fire regimes, permafrost conditions, and species distributions has made boreal forests a focus of concern for those attempting to predict future carbon cycle dynamics. Montane forests, which occur at high elevations on mountain ranges, exhibit patterns of species distribution and forest structure that reflect the environmental gradients associated with altitude. As elevation increases, temperatures decline, growing seasons shorten, and wind and snow stresses increase, creating conditions that progressively exclude species adapted to lower elevations. The resulting elevational zonation of vegetation types has been recognized since the explorations of Alexander von Humboldt in the early 19th century and remains a fundamental pattern in mountain ecology. Treeline, the elevation above which forest gives way to alpine vegetation, represents a boundary of considerable ecological interest because it marks the upper limit of tree growth under current climate conditions. The factors that determine treeline position are not completely understood. Temperature limits are clearly important, but the specific mechanisms through which low temperatures prevent tree establishment and survival above treeline involve complex interactions among carbon balance, tissue damage from cold events, and limitations on growing season length. Changes in treeline position over time provide evidence of past climate conditions and are being monitored as potential indicators of ongoing climate change, though the response of tree lines to warming is complicated by factors including seed dispersal limitations, soil development requirements, and competition with established alpine vegetation. The economic history of forests and forest products reveals how profoundly human societies have depended on trees and how this dependence has shaped both forest and societies. Before the widespread use of fossil fuels, wood was the primary source of energy for heating, cooking, and industrial processes throughout most of the world, and the availability of forest resources influenced settlement patterns, economic development, and even political power. Medieval European societies were organized in part around rights to forest resources, with elaborate systems of common rights, private ownership, and royal or noble prerogatives governing who could cut timber, gather firewood, graze animals, or hunt game in forested lands. The depletion of accessible forests near population centres created economic pressures that drove technological innovation, including the development of more efficient charcoal production methods, the substitution of coal for charcoal in iron smelting, and improvements in ship design that reduced timber requirements. The concern that timber shortages would constrain naval power motivated some of the earliest systematic efforts at forest management, including the establishment of state forestry services charged with ensuring sustainable timber production for military needs. The development of scientific forestry in German-speaking states during the 18th and 19th centuries represents a particularly important episode in the history of forest management and has influenced forestry practice worldwide. Faced with declining timber yields from forests that had been exploited without systematic management, German foresters developed mathematical models for predicting forest growth, techniques for measuring standing timber volumes, and management systems designed to maximize sustained yields. The normal forest concept, an idealized model in which equal areas at each age class would provide constant annual harvests in perpetuity, guided management planning even though achieving this ideal distribution was practically difficult. German forestry science was adopted in various modified forms by other countries, including France, India, and Japan, as colonial and national governments sought to rationalize forest management and secure reliable supplies of forest products. The emphasis in scientific forestry on monoculture plantations of commercially valuable species, while economically efficient in some respects, created forests that were often ecologically impoverished and vulnerable to pest outbreaks and other disturbances, leading to subsequent reconsiderations of management goals and methods. The transformation of forests through human activity extends far beyond intentional forestry management to include the cumulative effects of agriculture, pastoralism, urbanization, and other forms of land use. The deforestation of the Mediterranean basin during antiquity, driven by the need for agricultural land, construction timber, charcoal fuel, and shipbuilding materials, permanently altered the landscapes of that region and may have contributed to soil erosion and climate changes that affected subsequent agricultural productivity. Similar processes of deforestation accompanied agricultural expansion in medieval Europe, colonial-era tropical regions, and contemporary developing countries, though the specific drivers, rates, and consequences have varied across contexts. The recognition that deforestation can have negative consequences extending beyond the loss of timber and other forest products, including effects on water cycling, soil stability, biodiversity, and climate, has motivated conservation efforts and policy interventions whose effectiveness has varied considerably depending on local circumstances, institutional capacities, and competing economic interests. The carbon stored in forests has become a topic of intense interest in the context of contemporary concerns about climate change, as forests represent both a significant carbon reservoir and a potential tool for removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. The global forest carbon pool, including carbon in living biomass, dead organic matter, and forest soils, contains roughly twice as much carbon as the atmosphere, and changes in this pool can significantly affect atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations. Deforestation and forest degradation release stored carbon to the atmosphere, contributing to anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions, while forest growth and recovery remove carbon from the atmosphere and store it in woody biomass and soils. The dynamics of forest carbon cycling are complex, influenced by tree species composition, stand age, disturbance history, climate and management practices, and generalizations about forest carbon are often misleading because of the heterogeneity of forest systems worldwide. Young, actively growing forests typically absorb carbon rapidly, but contain relatively small total stocks, while old growth forests may have slower carbon uptake, but store large amounts of carbon that would be released if they were disturbed. The time frames over which forest carbon accounting should be conducted present particular challenges, as actions that increase carbon stocks over short periods may have different effects over longer periods, and vice versa. The biodiversity of forests encompasses not only tree species, but the vast assemblages of other organisms that depend on forest habitats for all or part of their life cycles. Conservative estimates suggest that forests harbour more than half of all terrestrial species, with particularly high concentrations of diversity in tropical forests, where even small areas may contain more tree species than entire temperate countries. The mechanisms that generate and maintain this diversity have been subjects of intensive research, with explanations ranging from historical factors such as stable tropical climates that have allowed species to accumulate over long periods, to contemporary ecological factors such as the fine-scale environmental heterogeneity of forest habitats. The loss of forest habitats to agriculture and other land uses is considered a primary driver of contemporary biodiversity decline, and the fragmentation of remaining forests into isolated patches creates additional pressures on species that require large areas or continuous habitat. Conservation strategies for forest biodiversity have evolved from simple protection of individual sites toward landscape-level approaches that consider connectivity among habitat patches, the management of land surrounding protected areas, and the ecological functions of forests on working lands. The relationships between trees and water cycling operate at scales ranging from individual leaves to entire continents and have significant implications for both natural ecosystems and human water supplies. Trees move enormous quantities of water from soil to atmosphere through transpiration. The evaporative loss of water from leaves that drives the cohesion tension mechanism of sap flow. A single large tree may transpire hundreds of litres of water per day during the growing season, and the aggregate water flux from forests significantly influences regional humidity, cloud formation, and precipitation patterns. The concept of the biotic pump, proposed by researchers examining the physics of atmospheric moisture transport, suggests that transpiration from coastal forests may actually draw moist air from over oceans inland, contributing to rainfall in continental interiors. This hypothesis remains controversial, but if correct, it implies that large-scale deforestation could reduce rainfall in ways that extend far beyond the deforested area itself. At smaller scales, forests influence water cycling through their effects on interception of precipitation by canopies, infiltration of water into soils, and timing and magnitude of streamflow, and these effects have practical implications for watershed management and water supply. The diseases and pests that affect trees have shaped forest composition and dynamics throughout evolutionary history, and continue to cause significant ecological and economic impacts. The chestnut blight that swept through North American forests during the early 20th century, caused by a fungal pathogen accidentally introduced from Asia, effectively eliminated the American chestnut as a canopy tree throughout its range within a few decades. The loss of this species, which had been one of the most abundant and economically valuable trees in eastern North American forests, transformed forest composition and affected numerous animal species that had depended on chestnut mast. Similar, though less dramatic episodes of pest-induced mortality continue to occur, with recent examples including the emerald ash borer in North America, the mountain pine beetle in western North American forests, and sudden oak death caused by the pathogen Phytophthora ramorum. The globalization of trade has increased the rate at which tree pests and pathogens are moved among continents, creating conditions for ongoing outbreaks as these organisms encounter tree populations that lack evolved defenses. Management responses to tree diseases have included quarantine measures to limit spread, removal of infected trees to reduce inoculum sources, and breeding programs to develop resistant varieties, with varying degrees of success depending on the biology of the pest or pathogen and the resources devoted to management. The genetics and genomics of trees have advanced rapidly in recent decades, providing new tools for addressing questions about tree evolution, ecology, and improvement. The sequencing of complete tree genomes, beginning with black cottonwood in 2006, and now including numerous additional species, has revealed unexpected features of tree genome organization and evolution. Tree genomes tend to be large, often containing many more genes than would be predicted from the complexity of tree morphology and physiology, and this gene content may reflect the developmental flexibility required for organisms that must respond to environmental variation over lifespans spanning centuries. Comparative genomic analyses are beginning to reveal the genetic basis for traits that distinguish trees from other plants, including wood formation, longevity, and the ability to grow to large sizes. Population genetic studies using molecular markers have documented patterns of genetic variation within and among tree populations, revealing the effects of past climate changes, geographic barriers, and human activities on the distribution of genetic diversity. These findings have practical applications for conservation, as populations with high genetic diversity or unique genetic compositions may be priorities for protection and for tree improvement, as understanding the genetic basis of desirable traits can accelerate breeding programs for timber and fruit production. The physiology of tree responses to environmental variation has been a focus of considerable research, particularly as climate change has raised questions about how trees will perform under novel environmental conditions. Trees, as long-lived organisms rooted in place, cannot escape unfavourable conditions through migration and must cope with environmental variation through physiological and developmental responses. The plasticity of tree form and function, the ability to adjust characteristics in response to environmental conditions, has limits that differ among species, and that influence which species will thrive or decline under changing climate. Drought stress, heat stress, and altered growing season timing are among the environmental changes most likely to affect trees in coming decades, and understanding tree responses to these stresses is critical for predicting future forest composition and productivity. Experiments that manipulate temperature, water availability, carbon dioxide concentrations, or other environmental factors have provided data on tree responses, though extrapolating from experimental results to predictions about tree performance over decades or centuries involves considerable uncertainty. Long-term monitoring of tree growth and mortality in forest plots provides complementary information about how trees are actually responding to environmental changes that have already occurred, though the attribution of observed changes to specific causes is often complicated by the multiple factors that influence tree performance simultaneously. The roles of trees in cultural and religious traditions across human societies are too diverse to summarize comprehensively, but share certain common themes that reflect the biological characteristics of trees and their relationships to human life. The great age that some trees attain has made them symbols of longevity, continuity, and connection across generations in many cultures, and individual ancient trees have often been accorded special reverence or protection. The seasonal cycles of deciduous trees, with their dramatic transformations between leafy abundance and bare dormancy, have provided metaphors for life cycles, death, and renewal that appear in mythologies and artistic traditions worldwide. The vertical structure of trees, reaching from roots in the earth toward the sky, has made them symbols of connection between terrestrial and celestial realms in numerous religious cosmologies, with the concept of a world tree or axis mundi appearing in traditions as distant as Norse mythology, Mesoamerican religion, and Hindu cosmology. Sacred groves, areas of forest preserved for religious purposes, have existed in many cultural contexts, and in some cases have functioned as de facto nature reserves, protecting biodiversity and forest cover in landscapes otherwise transformed by human activity. The significance of trees in human cultural imagination cannot be reduced to their material utility, though this utility has undoubtedly contributed to the attention and significance that trees have received across cultures. The practical cultivation of trees for fruit, timber, and other products has a history extending back thousands of years, and has produced domesticated tree varieties that differ substantially from their wild ancestors. The domestication of fruit trees appears to have occurred independently in multiple regions, with centers of early domestication in the Middle East, East Asia, and tropical regions producing the ancestors of contemporary orchard species. Unlike annual crops, which can be selected over human lifetimes through repeated cycles of planting and selection, tree domestication proceeds more slowly because of the long generation times of most tree species. Vegetative propagation techniques, including grafting, cutting, and layering, have allowed desirable tree varieties to be maintained indefinitely without sexual reproduction, circumventing the genetic recombination that would otherwise disrupt accumulated favourable trait combinations. The clonal nature of many orchard tree populations creates genetic uniformity that can be advantageous for consistent production, but also creates vulnerability to pests and pathogens to which the uniform population lacks resistance. Modern tree breeding programs combine traditional selection with molecular tools that allow breeders to identify individuals carrying desirable genetic variants without waiting for those variants to be expressed phenotypically, potentially accelerating the improvement of tree crops for productivity, disease resistance, and other traits. The relationships between trees and urban environments have received increasing attention as the proportion of human populations living in cities has grown and as evidence has accumulated regarding the benefits that urban trees provide. Trees in cities provide shade that reduces building cooling costs and mitigates urban heat island effects. They improve air quality by absorbing pollutants and particulates. They reduce stormwater runoff by intercepting precipitation and enhancing soil infiltration. And they provide aesthetic and psychological benefits that are increasingly documented through health and well-being research. The quantification of these benefits has supported arguments for urban forestry programs and has led to the development of tools for valuing the ecosystem services that urban trees provide. At the same time, urban environments present challenges for tree growth that differ from those in forest settings, including compacted soils, limited rooting space, pollution stress, altered water availability, and physical damage from vehicles and construction. The selection of tree species for urban planting involves trade-offs among multiple considerations, including tolerance of urban conditions, maintenance requirements, potential hazards from falling branches or roots disrupting infrastructure, and aesthetic and cultural preferences that vary among communities. The future of forests under conditions of ongoing environmental change is subject to considerable uncertainty, with projections depending on assumptions about greenhouse gas emissions, land use policies, and ecological responses that are not fully understood. Climate envelope models, which project the future geographic ranges of tree species based on their current distributions and expected climate changes, generally suggest that suitable climate conditions for many tree species will shift poleward and upward in elevation, potentially faster than trees can migrate through seed dispersal and establishment. The implications of these projected shifts for forest composition and function depend on numerous factors, including the extent to which tree performance is actually limited by climate versus other factors, the capacity of tree populations to adapt to changing conditions, and the interactions between climate effects and other stresses including pests, pathogens, and land use change. Forest management in the context of climate change has become an active area of policy and practice discussion, with debates about whether management should aim to facilitate the migration of tree species, maintain current forest types through intensive intervention, or accept novel forest compositions as inevitable outcomes of environmental change. The long-time scales over which tree populations respond to environmental changes create challenges for research and management that are distinctive to forest systems. Individual trees integrate environmental conditions over lifetimes that may span centuries, and the composition of forest stands reflects the conditions that prevailed during past episodes of tree establishment that may have occurred long before contemporary observers began monitoring. Forest dynamics unfold over timescales that exceed human career lengths and even human lifespans, making it difficult to design and maintain the long-term studies that would be needed to fully understand forest change. The establishment of permanent forest plots that are measured repeatedly over decades represents one institutional response to this challenge, and networks of such plots now exist in many forest types worldwide. Though maintaining consistent measurement protocols and data quality over long periods requires sustained institutional commitment that can be difficult to ensure. The integration of data from permanent plots with information from remote sensing, tree rings, historical records and other sources provides opportunities for understanding forest dynamics at scales that no single method could address alone. The anatomical and physiological specializations that allow trees to achieve their distinctive life form, large size and great age represent evolutionary innovations that appeared relatively late in the history of terrestrial plants, and that transformed terrestrial ecosystems when they did appear. The earliest vascular plants, which colonized land during the Silurian period approximately 450 million years ago, were small and herbaceous, lacking the woody tissue that would allow later plants to grow tall and persist for extended periods. The evolution of secondary growth, the process by which vascular cambium produces additional wood and bark, appeared during the Devonian period and allowed plants to achieve increasingly large sizes over subsequent geological periods. By the Carboniferous period, roughly 300 million years ago, forests of giant lycopods, tree ferns and early seed plants covered extensive areas of tropical lowlands, and the burial of organic matter from these forests contributed to the coal deposits that later powered industrial development. The subsequent evolution of the new tree lineages, including the conifers and the flowering plants that dominate contemporary forests, involved repeated innovations in wood structure, leaf form, reproductive biology, and other traits, creating the diversity of tree types that exist today. The fossilized remains of ancient trees and forests provide evidence about past environments that complements and extends the information available from tree rings and living vegetation. Petrified wood, in which the original organic tissues have been replaced by minerals while preserving anatomical structure, can reveal details of ancient tree biology including growth rates, responses to environmental variation, and relationships to modern groups. Fossil leaves, pollen, and other plant remains in sedimentary deposits document the composition of ancient vegetation and its changes over geological time. The reconstruction of ancient forests from such evidence is necessarily incomplete and subject to various biases, as different plant organs have different preservation potentials, and the processes of fossilization favour certain environments over others. Nevertheless, paleobotanical evidence has established that forests have expanded and contracted repeatedly in response to climate changes throughout Earth history, that tree lineages have migrated across continents as suitable habitat has shifted, and that the contemporary distribution of tree species reflects a complex history of evolution, extinction, and dispersal that extends back hundreds of millions of years. the philosophical and scientific questions raised by the study of trees extend beyond empirical investigation to fundamental issues about the nature of organisms, individuals, and life processes. The modular construction of trees, in which growth proceeds through the repeated addition of similar units rather than the development of a fixed adult form, raises questions about how tree individuality should be understood and whether concepts derived from the study of unitary organisms apply appropriately to modular ones. The potential immortality of some tree structures, in which cambial cells can divide indefinitely without the senescence that limits the lifespan of cells in most animals, challenges assumptions about aging and death as necessary features of living things. The symbiotic associations between trees and fungi, which are so intimate that it can be difficult to determine where one organism ends and another begins, complicate boundaries between individual and community that seem clearer in other contexts. These conceptual questions do not necessarily have definitive answers, but engaging with them can deepen appreciation for the distinctive biology of trees and the limitations of frameworks developed to understand other types of organisms. The study of trees thus encompasses an extraordinary range of disciplines, methods, timescales, and questions, from the molecular biology of wood formation to the global dynamics of the carbon cycle, from the practical concerns of forestry and agriculture to the philosophical puzzles of individuality and longevity. Trees have shaped human societies through their material contributions and their symbolic significance, and human activities have in turn transformed forests in ways that will influence their future trajectories for centuries to come. The knowledge that has accumulated about trees through centuries of observation, experimentation, and analysis remains incomplete, with active research continuing on questions fundamental and applied, and the integration of this knowledge into coherent understanding is itself an ongoing project that advances incrementally as new findings emerge and existing frameworks are revised. The continued study of trees is warranted not only by their scientific interest, but by their practical importance to human welfare and to the functioning of planetary systems on which all life depends.